So I'd like to welcome you today to NYU DC and to this event on effective global public policy. My name's David Cohen. I'm the director of the School of Public Policy and professor of political economy at UCL. And today is the launch in Washington of an exciting new Global MPA with New York University. It's the first of its kind in the world. It truly is a joint degree. It will be a degree that starts in New York with a term, moves to London, and then moves to an international organization or a public or private organization of the student's choice within the capstone programs. It's an intensive one-year program. It's aimed at mid-career civil servants who have 7 to 10 years work experience, and it's hoping to tackle the salient and important issues of global governance and global public policy today, trying to make sense of policy making in an incredibly complex, dynamic, and fast-moving environment. Today's talk on global public policy is the second in a series of talks. The first was last week with Gordon Brown, and we asked Gordon Brown to talk about global governance and the emergence of international and global coordination. And he gave a beautiful lecture on how and why and what we should delegate to international governance and to international regulatory authorities, looking at case studies of the environment, of trade, and of financial meltdown, of which he was sitting at the heart of. And he raised a number of important issues in terms of the rationale for regulation, the issues of accountability, the checks and balances that we can put in place if we move to this global level. But he also raised two important issues that I hope will sit at the heart of this MPA as well. He raised the issues of global polity and of global ethics. And I hope that this program, as well as helping people to manage this global program and make policy in this complex environment at the international level, will also help to invigorate the debate around global ethics and what we as a society and what we as individuals need to do to make the world a more equitable, a more efficient, and a more fair place. Today, we have many people grappling with these issues on a day-to-day basis, and I'm hoping that we'll look today at global public policy from the nuts and bolts, from practical experiences. We hope to have a series of talks in London and in New York over the coming years called Policy and Practice, and in a few weeks' time we will have Jack Straw talking in London about global political leadership. And so these themes will come round again and again. But today I hope that we'll discuss the issues of how policy emerges in a global sphere, has international organizations defining the questions, but the delivery often has to be at the local level. It often has to be with NGOs or with private actors, with companies, with consultancies and so forth. And so one of the issues I hope that will come up in the questions and in the discussion is how policy, starting at the top, is delivered on the ground with international, shall we say, street-level bureaucrats. The other issue I hope that will come up today, and already in the green room we started to discuss, is the translation of public goals and public ambitions into private actions. How can the private sector help in defining and driving forward public policy and helping us make sense of big issues? And Google launched last week, as part of the UN initiative, a fabulous project on comparative constitutions, and I hope that we will have a chance maybe to discuss some of this. So really this program and today's debate is how we manage vertical and horizontal networks and how these vertical and horizontal networks can feed into both agenda setting and into delivery and implementation. So with those broad and big ambitions, the panel today have been asked, and we are very lucky to have 4 distinguished thinkers from the public and private world to talk about how their organizations have grappled with formulating policy in this complex world. What are the benefits and problems of working with the public and the private? How have they managed this multi-level environment, this multi-level governance network? And perhaps the most important question, what advice would they give to the next generation coming into public policy and global public policy? We asked Gordon Brown to answer this question last week, and he said, just do better than my generation and do the MPA. So, so that's our plug for the program yet again. Okay, we have 4 fabulous speakers. I'm not going to hold the floor any much longer. We have Marco Canelotto, who's the Assistant Director of Fiscal Affairs at the International Monetary Fund. He's a leading expert on fiscal coordination. But in addition to having the big macro picture of fiscal coordination, he's also been on the ground. He's headed and been involved in over 60 missions for the IMF. And prior to joining the IMF, and obviously the international public sector debate, he was a researcher for the Italian state oil company, so he also has that private sector perspective as well. But perhaps trying to make sense of all of this, he's also had a 1-year sabbatical in New York, where he was a visiting professor, and during this time I know he had the opportunity to write a number of pieces both on pension reform, fiscal transparency, tax policy, and has a large volume coming out this April, or has just come out this April, on public finance management with the IMF. So I would very much recommend those readings. So Marco can bring both the macro and the micro to this discussion. Our second speaker is Ani Gupta. He's the Director of Knowledge and Learning at the World Bank. And again, while having the big picture, has also been involved at grassroots and spent a number of years, I believe, in Jakarta, involved on infrastructure projects. His areas of expertise are on urbanization, urban environment, and infrastructure. But again, working at the World Bank, I know he's grappling with the bigger public policy issues and these tensions sometimes between the economic models and the policy models that need to be delivered. So again, I look forward to hearing about that and the changing nature of the World Bank in this complex world. Then we have an in-house speaker, I hope doesn't need a great introduction, Sherry Gleed, who is the new Dean of the Wagner School. This is a fabulous alliance. We've only met last week, but I'm sure we'll be meeting each other on a regular basis. Before becoming Dean, she held a number of important positions in the public sector as well. She's been a leading professor in public health and management and has held a chair at Columbia University for a number of years. But in addition to that, she took a career sabbatical and was the Assistant Secretary of Planning and Evaluation in the Health Department. So really can bring that academic and that public sector perspective to the table. And then, last but not least, we have the Honourable Susan Ayari. She's the Vice President of Public Policy and Government Affairs at Google, but again brings really a diverse range of knowledge. She's been a member of Congress, has been a lobbyist, and a public affairs executive. But I think in light of everything that's going on this week, perhaps your greatest achievement, according to what I've been able to find out, is that as a member of the House and Budget Committee, you brought in the first balanced budget in the Congress in 29 years.
That is true, but I also was there for the first government shutdown, so.
Okay. Okay.
Good news, bad news on my part.
You didn't have to declare that. Okay, so there's a lot of expertise around this table, and I'm going to hand over to Marco to start. Thank you.
Okay, thank you so much, David, for your kind words, and thank you, everybody. And let me just start thanking Wagner for sort of inviting me tonight, and most of all for hosting me throughout the last 12 months, which has really been an opportunity for me to sit with faculty and students in a public service school. I think in my remarks, I really want to focus a little bit more on one of the last points that David mentioned. I don't think there's much point in me telling you what the IMF does or does well or does not so well. So let me perhaps focus a bit on what has been my personal experience, particularly in the last 12 months. Being an economist, I've always lived among economists. I've been an economist most of my life. I felt in the kind of work, and I've been clearly exposed to policy advice in all of my sort of tenure at the IMF. I sort of grew increasingly sort of uncomfortable with the fact that there is a somewhat fragmented view the way we approach policy advice at the global level and particularly in the field when we advise individual countries. And this is a bit also the dichotomy, particularly between economists and non-economists, which is clearly the vast majority of people involved in this area. And the uncomfortable feeling comes from the fact that we usually take the easy way. We rule out or we assume that politics are in another arena, so we don't have really to deal with politics. We focus on the best policy formulation and advice, and sometimes we tend to forget there is these things that's called politics that actually is the way kind of government actually functions. Clearly, the good and the best economists are kind of full aware of this, but I've seen a lot of, particularly new generation, coming through the best schools in the world, and they kind of lost touch with kind of reality in a way. So we've developed a generation of wonderful technicians, but I don't think they're really sort of able to think through the whole policy process. First of all, analyze what the problems are. Then try to come out to formulate a policy that can actually tackle the specific problem. We've all sort of become a little bit slave of what I call the tyranny of kind of the best practices. So because Australia's done something, everybody has to do what Australia's done, or New Zealand, or what have you. And that's why a lot of reforms, a lot of policies, they don't work. So they're kind of dead on arrival. So we try to satisfy what is a kind of an external validation process. If you look at the market rating or spreads and what have you, we try to go the easy way and try to satisfy those needs, and we tend to forget what the real needs, the real problems are. Politics is the way you translate all these, how these things becomes effective on the ground. So the idea of spending a year instead of a leading sort of economics department and spending instead time within a public policy school was exactly the idea to learn and try to bridge, certainly from my point, gaps that I felt I had, because again, we try to study all these things, but I'm certainly not a social scientist, and I'm certainly not a specialist. I've kind of, over the years, become a bit of a jack of all trades in this world. So the issue is really, everything is global, and we tend to perhaps overuse this word. But then when I look at the more micro level, particularly spending time with students, I think we're sort of failing collectively to create the next generation of global thinkers. There is this idea, because of excess of fragmentation, and particularly within sort of broadly defined public policy schools, there is this kind of lowest common denominator sort of syndrome, if I may use this expression. People come to this postgraduate school from different backgrounds: history, economics, sexual studies, health specialists, law schools, and what have you. And my expectation, perhaps was a little bit naive, was exactly that public schools managed to create this kind of global thinker out of all this. At least based on my experience, I'm not sure how successful these schools are because of this, what I call the lowest common denominator. You can't really go deep into economics because people haven't have enough background on economics. You can get enough into history, or you can get enough into sectoral things. You cannot do quantitative methods because, again, you try to sort of lower these. So my expectation was, again, instead of leverage and the synergies and create something new. In doing this, I'm not making myself perhaps too popular with Wagner. There are certain gaps that I found a little bit bizarre, to be honest. I had a conversation with a student once, and I just mentioned public goods. And clear, the student didn't have any idea what the public good is. You say everything the government produces. I said, well, not exactly. And then another student discussing sort of environmental costs, etc. I mentioned Ronald Coase and the path-breaking article of 1960. Now, because of his unfortunate sort of departure, I suspect most students now know who Ronald Coase is and what the seminal paper was. But 6 months ago, again, nobody knew who he was. one of the things that struck me, and to kind of make it a little bit more concrete, and this certainly in the U.S. Clearly, where I've had a lot of experience and exchanging with people with various schools, including the Kennedy School at Harvard, Syracuse, of course, Wagner, and across on the Pacific side. There's really no kind of basic, what used to be a public finance course. So a course that basically teaches students what the government is about. That really spends time discussing what the public goods, merit goods, and so on and so forth. The principle of taxation, the principle, what the budget is. In the end, the budget is I'm sure Mr. Molinari will tell us something about it. It's the way you really, that's where the rubber hits the road, as they say. That's the way you translate the policy formulation through the political process in what is actually feasible and achievable in reality. So I find that these things are sort of touched upon, but perhaps there's no kind of structure approach to this. Another very quick example, in most public policy schools, there's a fair amount of accounting, which is fine. I never did accounting in my old days, and I regret that. But much to my surprise, there's no discussion on national accounts, which are the magnitude, certainly the macroeconomists use it, but all policymakers have to basically deal with the identity between savings and investment. And most students simply don't have that. Now, these are a few gaps that in my mind could really sort of help kind of creating more of a global thinker, along with, for example, modern history or philosophy. I mean, the context and culture matters a great deal. And that's why a lot of policies, a lot of reforms, as I stated at the outset, they're kind of dead on arrival because they don't take into account the realities on the ground. So I think there are ways probably that this curricula can be sort of perhaps be less specialistic. So I think one of these might be one of the examples in which kind of less is more, and really help to create sort of the next generation of global thinkers that can really help devise global policies across the globe. So I will leave it at that, and thank you very much again. Sorry.
I didn't realize.
I should have given you some warning.
No, seamless. That's right. That was very nice, Marco. First of all, thank you very much for having me here and to be part of this very distinguished panel. It's a privilege to be part of this panel. The organizers, and I must want to add, it's a really cool building. It's the first time I'm here, so you were lucky to be here.
It's true.
The organizers of this event sent us some questions to prod us to think. And one of the questions were what policies, as Marco was talking about, is your organization worrying about? I work for the World Bank. They're worrying about a lot of policies all the time, just like the IMF. And what kind of people are you thinking about that should be working for the World Bank? These are really big questions, and the last point was you have 10 minutes to talk about it. So I just want to focus on two things. I work as was described as the director for knowledge and learning for the bank, which primarily means I worry about that the bank, besides pushing a lot of money out, actually puts knowledge and advice and package in a way that there is actual results on the ground, which as you can imagine, I worry a lot as part of my job. And the bank right now is going through a big transformation, exactly to talk about what is the new world and how do we react to it. And I just want to talk about two things that we are focused on. One at the big policy level, what exactly we want our organization to be. And then there's been a lot of discussion about what kind of people should be working for such an organization. So I thought I'll touch on those two. And there are many things happening in between, but 10 minutes is 10 minutes. So the first thing that bank is really worrying about is really not that much about policy. It's really worrying about a lot, not that policy is not important, that what happens to the end of how policies get implemented to get outcomes. So the worry in the bank right now has been, what is it that has to happen to get outcomes on the ground that actually has, welfare gains for citizens? That is a description of an outcome. And this is simply because it's very simple realization that development projects and people who work in development, and turns out in developing countries as well, most things don't actually work out as planned. Some things happen, and people you're trying to implement with actually don't want to implement it. They don't have incentive to do so. Politics come in between. People who are supposedly theoretical beneficiaries were never consulted. Many things happen for a project to not get its outcome. The question is that what is it that you need to do to overcome such delivery challenges, so to speak. And you would think this is a very obvious place to be, that things don't work out as planned, right? Most people would think that. But it's taken a bank about 60 years to get here. And it's been an interesting journey. I mean, when the bank was formed just after the World War, people really thought the problem was lack of finance. If you could just get the money to the right place, things will work out. And reconstructing Europe, that worked out for a while very well. It didn't really work out in other places that well. Then people thought, it must be the market failure. The market is not working. So a lot of the bank's work and IMF's work in the 80s and 90s was about how to fix the market. And then following that was how to fix policies. That is, when you even have market regulation, the government policy is a problem. But we have now worked in places where we actually have funds, we have policies in place, but still we don't get outcomes that we want. So the question was, what is this gap, and how can we deal with this gap? And I'll give you two very basic examples. One of the projects the bank is involved in, and the bank is involved in very little bit, it's a very big Indian government project to clean up the river Ganga, which is a 1,500-kilometer river, goes through most of civilization of the world. And it's as you can imagine, it's a daunting problem. It goes to the poorest part of the world, actually, Uttar Pradesh. And if you think about how do you clean it up, you think about multiple things that are required to clean up a river like that. The cities that are dumping on it, the ag industry that has insecticides in it, the plants along the dumping on it, and various other multi-layered government. The question is, can this problem be solved? And it turns out, actually, problems like this have been solved. I mean, in Europe, for example, over many years, Danube was cleaned up. It took many decades to do so. So that's an example of a very large problem that we are dealt with that actually doesn't necessarily, might have a policy problem. The government has put together a lot of funds, yet there is no traction, not much. So we are trying to figure through what is it that we could do to help such a, and what comes across is to how to figure out this multidimensionalness you talked about and multisectoralness of these problems. And how do you get different kind of people who think differently, bring different kind of perspectives to ground to work together to solve problems, not only at a particular place, but also particular layers of the government. Problem like Ganga, national government involved, every city government in the 5 states it goes through. So this layering of the problem, of the scale, the difference in scale, and also the various sectors that are involved in to solve something like that, is something we are very, very concerned about, and figuring out, how does one, in an organization as large as ours, how does one bring such flexible deployment of people across the various layers of the government? And as you can imagine, that is a relatively big challenge. Given, organization like the bank, we are very keen about to have a clear beginning and a clear end. So we have a project, we go to our board, have a five-year plan of what will happen, and then we hope to complete it. Imagine going for a project like Ganga and having a 5-year plan, because even the first 6 months is a nightmare to actually get through. So the point I'm making is we're actually trying to rethink how exactly do you structure organizational processes. This is what I'm very much involved in. That actually can respect this reality of very unpredictable transaction that takes place. And that you can actually structure an internal process. Because these bureaucracies like ours create process to make things very predictable inside the organization when we're actually dealing with a rather unpredictable set of things that's happening outside the organization. So how do you mix this? How do you bring it together? And we've come up with some plans or some basic principles of how to get the right kind of knowledge. And you talked about knowledge, Marco, earlier. How to get the right kind of knowledge, the right place. And the point that we are focused on, and as a development organization, is what is this kind of knowledge? So that is most cherished or most in demand by our clients. So Marco talked about knowledge at a public finance level, at a macro level. Not really, you won't call it macro level, but at a government level. But we're also talking about knowledge that is learned by doing on the ground. How do you capture when things work out? And going and testing out locally to see how that knowledge transfers locally. So very much away from the best practice dictum, that if you have a best practice, you learned it somewhere and you will just replicate it in a market out. It never works. So the question is how to learn from other places and actually apply the knowledge and test and experiment locally to see what works. And how can you actually encourage this experimentation locally to figure out what actually works on the ground, to move the discussion, to build coalitions, or political coalitions, to get a movement. This is the kind of discussion that's going on. As you can imagine, this kind of thinking that's, I'm sure it's very possible at Google, is actually rather difficult in a very structured organization like ours. So that's the one end of the discussion. Now the other end of the discussion, I could go on about this, is about what kind of people then we want in an organization like this. And and we haven't solved this. There's a conundrum there that I just want to share with you. When we talk to our clients, meaning ministries, Ministry of Finance, the most thing they talk about is they want people with deep technical knowledge. They want the person who has cleaned the Danube to come and work for them. They want the person who actually has done 5 hydro projects. So they want a technically competent person who actually done 15 things on it. So that's kind of person they have in mind. But when you look at the problems that need to be solved, they're actually not single technical problems. There never is. They're all actually multidimensional problems that actually needs people who can connect the dots between different disciplines, can think differently between different disciplines. And this is a conundrum, because if you really want the person who has cleaned up the Danube, you can't expect them to bring that deep technical knowledge with people who are able to translate between different ways of thinking, different disciplines. I think that is what we find is critical for our success, the ways to think about it, sociologists and economists, and these schools, these disciplines teach us to think about a particular way, problem solving, is to be able to move around. So the last thing I want to say, so we are going through, okay, what do we do? And we are actually going through a major organizational change to make sure we can have this vertical depth and horizontal assembly of solutions. We're trying to figure out a marketplace in an organization where demand for actual problems can be then catered by multiple sectors or practices that will produce a solution, so we can actually have multi-sectoral teams. The last thing we are worried about a lot, and this is what I'll leave you with, is an organization like ours, and this is another conundrum, which has a lot of technical people, a lot of economists, like the IMF, and a lot of other people too, thankfully. But no disrespect. But it does have other people. It didn't actually. 20 years back, they were mostly economists, but thankfully things actually moved on. But the problem I was focusing on is that when you actually have a large technical organization and you work with the government, and this is true for all large technical organizations, you tend to be very driven with the solution, the things you know how to do. So if you have a plumber and you bring the plumber home, they will find pipes that are broken in your house. So the question is, how do you actually get to a very problem-driven way of working rather than a solution-driven way of working? And this we feel is a central problem that we face, why we don't get to solutions very often, is actually we are not defining the problem properly at the locally. And we are actually going with a set of solutions, set of things that we've thought about that, and this is true, not just bank is evil or another, it's just the people who work there are actually fully technical people. This is the kind of people you want to have in the organization. When they go there, they actually come with a set of solutions that they have in mind. So we are trying to work through how do you break this? How do you actually create a set of people who actually worry about the client, about the set of problems that can actually marry together an actual marketplace of ideas. We haven't solved it. We are struggling through it. Once we solve it, we'll let you know. Thank you.
Thank you. A big ambition.
Hi. So I have been dean at Wagner for 2 months, which means that I don't know as much about it as I ought to. But Wagner is a very interesting place with a long tradition of being a very locally focused school. It really grew up out of New York City, out of this great metropolis. And it grew up thinking about the problem of integrating public policy and public management, not just having a good idea, but putting it into operation. Over time, that local focus has really spread. It has an important national focus and increasingly a global focus, initially really thinking much more about development, about the very kind of local development that is analogous to what it had always done in New York City. With this new program with University College London, you can see the school really taking that same kind of insight that you need to put policy development and policy management and administration together and putting it into a truly comparative perspective by thinking, how do things work, forcing the students, in effect, to think about how do things work in New York and how do they work in London, just because you are in both of those places and they don't work the same way. So even experientially recognizing that you need to think about institutional structure, about history, about culture, and all of those things just in the course of putting policies to work. One of the other things that is coming out of this kind of program is moving this focus from domestic policy, from local policy to domestic policy, to development policy, and into the spheres of sort of macrofinance kinds of policy that Marco was talking about at the beginning, which traditionally has not been where public policy schools have located themselves. But this really is an opportunity to take the same kinds of insights and move them into that area. But I'm particularly excited about it because I work in domestic policy. My work has always been in healthcare policy, and that's what I do. But over time, especially over the sort of thinking about the last 15 or 20 years, I can really see that the world of health policy itself, a fundamentally domestic policy issue. Each country really runs its own healthcare system. There are not any apparent connections between them. Healthcare is very local. And yet, over the past 15 or 20 years, if you look at the healthcare landscape, you can see where even there, having a global insight and having that kind of perspective is really important. So let me just give you 3 examples of how I see that has happened. The first one is, I actually worked on healthcare reform the first time back in 1993, and again this time around, and the conversation has changed completely. The big line when we started work on healthcare reform in 1993 was, we can't do healthcare reform. This is the United States. We have the best healthcare system in the world. That was so much taken for granted, I think, even among proponents of healthcare reform, that we had to be very careful. Whatever we did, we didn't want to mess up the best healthcare system in the world. You know, in the intervening period, people began to ask the question, how do you know you have the best healthcare system in the world? On what basis can you make that claim? And they began to ask questions around measuring performance. What does it mean to have the best healthcare system? Don't just say it, show it. And it turned out that in many respects, the United States cannot claim it has the best healthcare system in the world. We're a very costly system. We don't have great outcomes, and improvement in outcomes over time has been slower than in the United States than in many other countries. But on some dimensions, we do have some really great things in our healthcare system. Rapid technological innovation, really interesting organizational innovation. Looking around at other countries, what we can see is, making these international comparisons, we can see what economists would think of as like, what is the frontier? Where could you be given the resources that you're putting into the healthcare system? What is possible? This is not the same thing as best practices. It's really trying to set ambitious goals for yourself by saying, what is within the feasible set? Where can we learn from other countries? Where do our institutional structures differ? What does the existing technology allow us to achieve? And what are the structural factors that got us to where we are? Second, very different area. In the same period, what you saw was the development of antiretroviral therapy for HIV, and a complete change in how global organizations, national organizations, philanthropies, private organizations thought about global development in the health sphere. What we learned is that people had worried a lot about the global spread of disease, about globalization and its impact on public health in a negative sense. But with antiretroviral therapy, you also saw globalization in a positive sense. You have technologies that are developed in the rich world that actually spread into poorer countries. But they raise a whole new set of issues. Raise issues around who's going to pay the cost, who pays for innovation, what do you do with intellectual property issues around technologies that have benefits globally that are not only domestic. These are questions that span national and global governance, and they led to an unprecedented set of global, national, public-private partnerships around the world trying to deal with the disease. It engaged the public sphere and the private sphere in really new ways, and it led to new ways of thinking about prevention, treatment, drug innovation, and so on. Let me give you a third example. Over this same period, we've really seen a shift from focus on infectious disease to chronic disease, and the recognition that these chronic disease risk factors that we're concerned with are actually the same worldwide. So consider smoking, for example, tobacco control policy. Tobacco control policy is a really interesting area because strategies, attitudes, culture, which you would think were really local, have turned out to actually spread. No one would have anticipated that there would be a day would come when you could not smoke a cigarette in a bar in Paris, right? If you think about all those movies, those bars are full of smoke. How did that idea move? It was basically innovation in the public sphere in different countries that actually changed what policymakers thought about in terms of their engagement with the private sphere. What could you do? What were possible regulations that you might think about? And now we see obesity, similarly a worldwide problem, spanning sectors, where you have concerns about how food policy is made, concerns about how cities are designed, and even the same issues happening in very low-income countries, which simultaneously have problems of obesity and hunger, and in high-income countries. So we really have this cross-national new ways of thinking about these problems. So even to think about an area that seems fundamentally, intrinsically domestic in nature, like healthcare, which is completely local, not even national, we need to think differently. We need to think about the frontiers. We need to think grandly about where we belong in the international sphere, about performance measurement, about outcomes assessment. We need to understand how actions in one country, particularly around technology, around how we think about the world, around Google, which is a beautiful example of the same thing. In this context, technology is the primary driver of rising healthcare costs and of improvements in healthcare. But it also has similar impacts in many other areas. So we need to think globally about how technology works and how it affects domestic policy development systems, and how interrelated systems are both domestically and globally. Food policy, for example, and health policy, agricultural employment, and obesity are related issues. So there are no issues, I think, anymore that I can think of that, or maybe there never were, that are truly siloed either within a country or within a sector. Nor in our modern economies can we think of any problems that are tackled exclusively by the public sector, or exclusively by the global governance sector, or exclusively by the private sector. Everything is much more interrelated. So what does this mean for students? I think even students who are interested in domestic policy, let alone those who are interested in issues that are intrinsically global, like the ones that you all speak about, they need to understand both concepts that span areas, like Marco talked about concepts in public finance, public goods, things like that, that are universal concepts, and the institutional specificity that talks about how those concepts translate into action at the local, at the domestic policy level. They need to understand what we can learn from one another and where culture and institutions mean that we have to be very careful about learning from one another. We need to learn how to manage processes that span governance structures, as we did with HIV. So we understand what we do when we have unprecedented problems and we have to make unprecedented partnerships. And we need to see problems as spanning different sectors, not thinking only about health policy, not thinking only about monetary policy, but trying to recognize both the global nature in every sense of our policies and also how the specificity of sectors and populations. So trying to merge that idea of thinking at 30,000 feet and operating on the ground.
Well, thank you. And first of all, let me join in thanking you for having me here. I don't know if you said this in my introduction, but I was a member of Congress and I was from New York. So yes. That's sort of my background. I'm a Staten Island girl, but I'm
Okay.
really always pleased to be a part of this great educational institution, and I am thrilled to be on a panel with such distinguished speakers. So I work for Google now, and I wanted to just talk a little bit about what we got in our invitation is the topic of today, and it was global public policy and shifting landscape. And David, when you talked in your introduction, you used the words dynamic and fast-moving. And certainly, I think when we talk about the need for a program like this and the world in which you are all inheriting and in which we are all trying to understand, it is the speed at which all this information, all these thoughts, all these ideas cross our brains, cross to other people, and cross the pond. And that is something that has been a dramatic change over the last few years. Think about the fact Google last week celebrated its 15th birthday. And it is now such a ubiquitous form of all of our lives. And I don't say this just because I work at Google, but it helps. Go back 4 or 5 years, there were no apps. We were all thought we were so technically innovative because we had our BlackBerries and we could send out an email, albeit not well, and make a phone call. But there were no apps to get us from here to there. There were no map locations. There were no, how could you tell the weather? I mean, there were all these things that we take for granted in terms of the instant access to information. And that has had an implication on all of our policies, right? A few years ago, if you went to members of Congress or major policymakers in the technological space or in any space, and you said, what's the major issue that you think we're confronting today? Almost all of them would probably say, on a technology evolving platforms, would be net neutrality. Today, if you ask them, they're going to talk about STEM, they're going to talk about the economy, they're going to talk about copyright, they're going to talk about censorship, they're going to talk about immigration being an issue that impacts all of our discussions and all of our lives, because there is this acceptance of a multi-stakeholder world in which we need to draw upon people from all over the world and in which they need to be able to rely on us in our best judgment. So speed. Think about the fact now we all know, well, we at Google know, 97% of shopping goes online. Now, they might not buy online, but 90% of purchases, and that goes for elected officials, forming an opinion, all go online first to actually make their decisions. That has had a tremendous implication on the world in which we live, how decisions are made, how decisions are translated. So speed has taken over so much of our decision making. And so what does that mean? That means we have to get information quickly, we need to be able to make our decisions quickly, and we need to adapt as quickly as possible in this world. And when we talk about global, certainly once you talk about breaking down those geographic boundaries and we talk about the speed with which those boundaries have been broken down and how technology has allowed us to communicate so much more quickly, you have to come to the end result that the global world in which we live is the only reality for anyone who is, under 50 today. That is going to get more and more impactful when we don't have to go too many years back or to find an example any more dramatic than the Arab Spring, at how the global movements, global discussions can cause change in one area of the globe so far away. We talked about before a project that Google is working on very nicely with the University College of London called Constitute. In acknowledging this global society, Google and the university got together and now has online constitutions from all over the world, from states, from countries, so that people who are looking to build, study, or hopefully be thrilled by constitutions, can now go online and look at any state, any country. You can look by topic. And to me, that is just an incredible analysis of the shrinking world in which we live, right? Because somebody might, in fact, find interesting and can access a constitution of a place that is so far away, or that it can, in fact, give someone who's trying to write a constitution some ideas of how it is done in a place that they have never been before. Lastly, let me just talk about something that I think, if there's any doubt about the impact, the need to get in the game on global, let's talk about internet governance. All of our speakers talked about it, so let's just take Google out of it. Let's just talk internet, the impact that it has on all of our discussions, on all of your goals. One of the major discussions that's been taking place over the last few years is who's going to govern the internet. Is it going to be a UN body? Is it going to be a different form? What are going to be some of the restrictions that may be placed on it? Who's going to have a say on it? What an important global public policy that will determine the success or the failures of all the goals that we outlined if we don't get it right. So I think there's just so much that has changed in our world in my short time. And so I guess I'll close because I'd rather get to your questions and get to the point of advice. Larry Page, who is one of our founders, says that at Google we should have ideas that allow us to be uncomfortably excited. So it shouldn't be, and you really, in Google, you can't go to somebody with incremental change. They want big change. They want change that doesn't allow for here's how it's going to fix it today. Here's how it's going to fix it, way into the future. And so I guess if I were to give anybody advice, it is to look at the world in which I described, where information is moving so quickly, and Lord knows what it's going to be 10 years for, over the next 15 years, where the global, where the world in which we live gets smaller, and we work more collaboratively in so many ways, and in so many ways we don't. Where the challenges are great, but the opportunities are greater. And so I guess if I had any advice, it would be in this world, compared to the world when I graduated for college, where you just had to be good to get by. Now you just need to think those really big thoughts and put the confidence of who you are, your education, and your dreams behind that. And again, just set your goals so that you are uncomfortably excited. Thank you.
I hope these ideas have made you all uncomfortably excited. We'll have enough questions. Okay. I was also very relieved. I'd like to thank all of our practitioners for their insights, and I was relieved that some of the questions that they were addressing in their organizations are hopefully some of the questions that we'll be helping our students to grapple with, from whether it's comparative policy and analysis of comparative policy to managing change, which is something that we're emphasizing very much within this executive program, to experimental and experiments to coordinate and to collaborate in I'm going to steal your expression, the vertical depth and the horizontal assembly. I think that is really something that is incredibly important, and I hope will help to tool the next generation to try and grapple with this. But at the same time, I also agree with our first speaker, Marco, that we need to have, if required, the specialists as well. And if students want to come onto our program, while they can take the broad base, or they can get the tools and the experimental tools to do the horizontal, if you want them to also go into depth into areas, you can within this program. And I should have thanked Paul Smoke, who isn't here today, but is one of the leading professors at NYU in public finance, and one of the founders, in fact, the founder of this program. You do have the opportunity to take core economics or core public finance options as well going forward. Okay, I think it's time now to take questions. What I would like you to do is if you could just introduce who you are and who your question is for. It may be for the whole panel, and then I will put it to whoever you suggest. So who would like to go first? Yes.
I'm Bob Hershey. I'm a consultant. The world is now all on the internet, and the question comes up, can the internet be used to help coordinate people's public decisions and coordinate their joint funding for things and give everybody a say and get everything transparent?
Okay.
Well, yes. I think if we look, so first of all, I think that's probably one of the biggest goals that Google has, that a lot of companies have in the tech space today, is very sort of the core creed of what, and I know I keep saying Google, but technical people, young people all over, having to do with transparency. And I think that's a real big generational shift of the people who help to build and have that vision of the internet want to make sure that it is as transparent as possible, and so that their people, their users, can understand what the motives are and how this all works and what the repercussions are. So I think you hit on a word that is really very important to the future functioning and the viability of the web, and that is the transparency, because it is the global, national, local place for discussion, right? I mean, when we look at the fact that elected officials now are having major debates on major issues like healthcare, if they're not taking to the floor of the House of Congress, they're having these debates on Twitter to each other, back and forth. I mean, it has become the place when you look at search, which Google has, right? How elected officials during the course of a campaign will set up ads against each opponent's name based on search results. So I think it is the forum, and when we talk about an ability to translate ideas quickly, to inform people so that the mechanisms of, so I'll go back before I got to Google, but SOPA PIPA, which had to do with intellectual property, was a big debate at Google. And in Washington, DC, it was a big piece of legislation that was about to pass. And for some of you may remember, Google had like a black strip, I think, but Facebook went down. I mean, it was a big deal. And users who are constituents lit up, started writing into to their legislators. And I have this here, so I don't want to, but I mean, immediately it turned around, and then I'm going to stop. But I think, let's see if I can find this. The impact in terms of members who went off the bill, members who said they were going to support the bill, it was literally a 360% shift. And why was that? Because instantaneously they could hear from their constituents. So it is shaping and changing politics for better or for worse. And I think that impact, again, is something that's going to make the conversation that takes place around the globe in terms of public policy, it will continue to make the world smaller. It's now part of... again, not to sound like an old person, but, you go back to trade deals, right? And the so much time was spent on bilateral trade deals, or where you talk about how goods were transported over the ocean and what was going to regulate the ports. And now, we're talking about the transportation of ideas around the world, and how is that going to be regulated, and how is that written into our trade agenda. So it has an impact in so many areas of our life. And so I'll get off my bandstand, but just to say, that's why I think this conversation that's taking place at the UN, at the ITU, at these wickets, in terms of how we're going to govern this technology and allow for transparency and allow for this free flow of information, has really profound impacts on the future that we are all going to enjoy or not.
Okay, Sherry?
So I would just note that we would never have been able to do a program like this if it were not for things like the internet, right? I mean, the idea that you could collaborate on a joint program with a university on the other side of the pond, if we had to do it by letter and telephone call, it could never have happened. And this kind of, and not only, I mean, so that's sort of trivial. Of course, we can do it this way because of the internet, but it also means if you design a program like this, the opportunities that you have available to you, the thought that the students will leave one campus and go to the other and remain in touch with their faculty and continue doing capstone projects, all of those things are a function of the new technology. And you see universities, I mean, really exploding around these ideas.
We hope in the long run that we will stream lectures to one another, that there really will be this alliance will be more than people arriving in London or going to New York, but that our experts and our politicians can talk to your experts and your politicians through streaming and other such devices.
Great.
If I can just add a very different dimension to this same point, is that we feel very strongly that in public policy in developing countries, there's a vast asymmetry of information between politicians, academics, civil society. So one of the agenda bank has is actually to invest in public good investments of data, so having it available for people so they can make their own analysis of what's going on. So there's a huge dimension of this transparency brings, making it easier, cheaper for us to actually put this and accessible. The other side that we are very excited about is the possibility of not only pushing data, but actually pulling in opinions from citizens in governance, which is a vast amount of work going on in that. In Africa actually is much advanced in using SMS systems to get information back, to get feedback back from. Very, very, very exciting. We're actually running in Latin America a poverty survey, which would take us years to do and very expensive, through actually paying people time in their phone to answer questions, and it's a
Yeah.
fantastically successful program. It's only possible because such networks actually, because the poverty surveys, you have to go back to the same family over time to get a reasonable set of data. So vast amount of things are changing in a fundamental way because of technological changes.
And just to your point, this is the game changer, really, right? When we talk about international, that there are very few places where people don't have cell phones, who don't have that mobile device.
So much, yeah.
And it does allow for that communication that just didn't take place before. Sorry.
Okay.
Well, I agree with everything that's been said, so let me try to say a couple of things that counter. Just to be a little bit careful. First of all, access to internet, again, is fairly limited in the vast number of countries. And within countries, there is a bit of a generational divide.
Yeah.
So one has to be a little bit careful on this. The other thing that makes me a little bit nervous, and we're in a sort of living experiment in Italy with this new movement that just came up just only a few months ago, which is totally based on internet. I'm a little bit sort of nervous when I see that big policy debates on Twitter.
So are we.
So I mean, we have to, sure, checking the poll, checking the consensus, that's what the people has to say or react within, I've even forgot how many sort of, words or whatever. I think it's kind of phased all this purpose to create the next global individual, global thinker, global public policy. So again, everything's been said, absolutely, the technology is fantastic. It allows us to do incredible things, but also we have to be a little bit careful of the dangers that can be there.
Absolutely, I agree. Internet
Remember when
penetration
we
is...
used to worry about policy in a soundbite? Those were the good old days, right?
That darn cable TV, what are they turning us into?
Now it's a tweet.
Okay, I think we should move on to our next question.
Hi, my name is Cynthia Cheatham, and I'm a program manager. And I think your comment actually just kind of sparked, and I really think any of you could answer this. How do you think access to kind of knowledge is going to change the public policy landscape? Because not just the internet, but how do you think that'll kind of influence it, considering that you kind of who has been the subject matter experts on whatever the topic could be? People are going to think, well, because I've read this article or because I've had this Twitter debate or whatever that means. How do you think that'll shape it? Because kind of your comment about like the SOPA, what happened in advocacy, kind of Congress members were like, oh no, I don't want to make my constituents angry. So what does that mean in the public policy realm when people, I think having access to information is absolutely important, but there's a negative side of it. So you could even say that with regard to the Affordable Care Act or pick any kind of policy matter. How do you think, where do you see that going? And I think that's kind of that interdisciplinary broad question that you were talking about.
She starts at this end with Marco this time.
Oh, me? Oh boy, I have to react quickly. I think I like to kind of put this distinction here. I think people are increasingly more informed. Information is not knowledge. We have to be a little bit careful. Now there is a word, I'm going to use it, but I'm going to date myself. We used to talk about culture, education, and broader sense of the world. It's gone. We not even use that word because it's passé, it's sort of. But that's what makes the difference. When I was trying to make the point before in creating the new global individual, I think we have to think in terms of perhaps a new humanism. That you have to really feed the individual from the basics. I'm really concerned when I see my kids that they don't read. I might be pessimistic again, I may be sort of old-fashioned. This is going to cause trouble down the road. And with not reading is not watching the right movies, not listening to the right music, not enjoying art, not developing a sense of taste, and what have you. So all that is sort of is going. They're much more informed than I am. They can move very fast, very quick. on their application and whatever. But again, the knowledge, I don't think is there. So again, that's why I think we have to be a little bit careful, use the technology what it's good for, and not let technology drive the process. Otherwise, I think we're going to kind of be in trouble. Looking at animate the point, all access to internet and telephones, etc., in low-income countries in Africa. Sure, that's good, but I'd rather have more access to clean water than to cellular telephones, for example. So we have to be a little bit careful how we keep these things in checks and balance. Otherwise, the whole process is going to be skewed in one direction.
Okay. Sorry, Annie.
So I actually agree with Marco's first point about knowledge and information, but I'm going to go in a different direction from that point on. I actually agree. I think information, this is something I worry about a lot in my work. I think there's a bit of difference between what is information and what is knowledge. And I'm actually all for more information available to more people and let people choose what they want to consume. And you can see a lot of that is happening. Knowledge is a judicious application of information to get a particular result, a particular context. And I think Mark is absolutely right. There's a lot of confusion between what is information and what is knowledge. And just because information is available doesn't really mean you have a solution. To solve something, you actually have to apply that in a particular context. And more you think about it, and more you look at what success looks like, where people have gotten success, is actually where people have been able to marry these two and actually get people who have the judgment, who actually are able to, in most development contexts, there's so many variables that are so difficult to model, predict. You actually need to have this experience to know what is important, what is not, how to chart a course and muddle through. So I personally think judgment is very, very important. But at the same time, leveling the playing field with information is something I personally believe in. As an organization, we very much support. So I would very much vote for distinguishing the two.
And if I could just jump in, these are all just platforms, right? They don't make people do these things or not watch TV or go to an art museum. They're platforms in order to help you make some more decisions and expand your decisions. As a matter of fact, Google works throughout the world to digitize art museums so that more people can have access to great art in Italy, even if they never get a chance to go there and experience that. So it does give you an opportunity, but it does require a cultural conversation. It does require norms. It does require society and families and schools deciding their priorities. And making decisions just like they did when television came out, or when cable TV came out, or when Netflix came out. Anytime you increase a choice, you have to have a conversation about priorities and how that all happens. And so I guess information isn't knowledge, although it does make knowledge a lot more possible with the right constructs. And I just would close on SOPA PIPA. What happened there is that members of Congress heard from their constituents. And I guess I would submit that for better or for worse, that's how this democracy is supposed to work. And in most cases, it actually does. You can't have a debate on a soundbite, but being able to have your constituents access their legislators and tell them what's important and what's not is to me a very positive move in a democratic society. Maybe it's because I'm not in there anymore that it seems like such a good idea. But I think that actually is it's a sign of success.
So just to bring it back to education a little bit, I mean, I think people have raised a number of ideas that I think are very important, like judgment and reasoning and balancing breadth and depth. But I'm really struck by the echo of Gordon Brown last week and what he said, which is, you know, one of the components of education that we have to remember to return to our education in public service are ideas like ethics and humanism. Right. It's not just about knowing what year Columbus discovered America. It's about being able to understand what that means in a lot of not that, but anything, what it means in many different contexts within a culture, within a humanistic view.
And it comes back as well to Arnie's point as well. You've got to have this sort of the skills, not just the knowledge. Knowledge will tell you there's a solution. You can't see why the solution doesn't work.
Right.
You've got to have the skills to identify the problems and then to have the analytical ability to move beyond the problem. And so I think this is hopefully what universities in this program can deliver. I know there's a question waiting patiently in the top here.
Tom Coleman.
I thought that was you.
Susan's former colleagues in the House, and we're both glad we're not in there.
He was there for the first shutdown too, weren't you, Tom? Yeah.
No, I was out.
Did you come by then? Okay.
Yep.
His timing was better.
All of you have made some significant contributions here today, and I made a few notes, and one of them was culture counts is important in the context. That we need more than just technicians, we need people who see the big picture, who understand. Vertical and horizontal, enough said. And Susan, I don't want to be a skunk at the picnic, but I'm going to throw this out and see what you say, and the others as well. Information, the internet, and all of these things that we've talked about, we haven't mentioned the word privacy. And privacy goes to healthcare, electronic records, health records. It goes to development agency. It goes to this transatlantic university or program that you're putting together. Now, we just recently, in the last couple of months, recognized, because of a gentleman who released all the information about what our security apparatus in this country is doing. The Europeans are pushing back, especially the Germans because of their culture and heritage, but the rest of the EU is as well. So I throw that out, that little stink bomb.
That was an easy one. Good.
The stink bomb, and see what kind of response you have, because this overlays everything that you've talked about and really is a cross current of everything. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you. Big question. Susan, would you like to start?
Well, I think that is an important question, and it's a question that obviously tech companies go through all the time because of the way we want to value the information that we get from our customers, so that we can better serve them in so many ways. If I look at my mobile device right now, it's going to tell me how I can get home, what's the best way I can get home, what time my husband's flight is landing. There's so many access. It makes my life easier because I am willing to share that information with them so that it can throw back. Now, so I think it's something that we always have to be careful with and have that constant conversation. When you get to the NSA and PRISM, I think I'll let somebody else start that one. I mean, obviously, let me just say that's something we're actually waiting right now because we filed, Google and some other companies filed against FISA to show more transparency, to be able to open up to the American public, this conversation and acknowledge, to be able to have more transparency on all of this. Let me just put it that way. So this is, from a global perspective, it's probably as big an issue as it gets. That's all I'll say. Pass it over to you.
Take a few more questions, I think. There's a lady waiting over there, very politely. Yeah.
Hi, I'm Laurel McFarland.
You only have one mic.
Okay. Hi, I'm Laurel McFarland. I'm the executive director of NASPA, which is the organization of 300 graduate schools of public policy, public affairs. And I guess I have a practical question that the four of you have provided us, I think, with a great list of things that the next set of global leaders should be learning and competent in and so forth. You guys have a one-year program, and I guess this is a question for Sherry and for you,
Okay.
that how many of these fine aspirational things have you been able to cram into this one-year curriculum so far, and what do we take out? What's been in, what's the baggage that's left in the way we've been preparing people for public service in the past that we can let go of in order to accommodate some of these new goals?
Okay, the very fact that it's an executive program as opposed to an MPA means that hopefully, yes, we can strip some of the materials out. So the traditional MPA or MPPs would have a much stronger, much larger component of research methods, of core economics, introductions to whatever. The idea of this program is an assumption that you're not coming to become a specialist economist, you're not coming to become a specialist sociologist or a specialist, whatever it is that you can do within some of the 2-year large programs. You can retool or you can become something new on an MPP or an MSc, and that's what I see on for my students that come in on these general programs. The idea here is that people are coming, and they already have been in government or in an organization for 7, 10 years, and they're wanting to look at the world in a different way. And so a lot of the core courses, there are 2 core courses, NYU, and then 2 core courses at UCL. NYU, they're doing the institutions and the multi-level governance aspects of the program, and the public finance, you'll be glad to hear as well. And then they come to UCL and they're doing sort of managing change and delivering an implementation of policy in a multi-level environment. So we really are trying to explore the complexity of policy making. These are people that have been in that world, and we're trying to give them tools to work in that complex world, to manage the relationships. We hope to develop a course called Policy and Political Leadership, which will be a hybrid of practitioners who've come. They talk about the pain that they went through in the Senate, in the House of Commons, as a political leader, or a top civil servant who's been the chair, the head of cabinet, and talk about their experiences, and then we backstop it with the theories of management and the theories of leadership, to try and make sense of the dilemmas and the problems that these individuals were going through. Now, having said all of that, you may have somebody who comes from the IMF who wants to retool in microeconomics or some aspect of high-level game theory. If they want to do that, in their options, they can go to UCL's economics department, one of the top 5 in the world, and they can do that. They can go and do management or economic programs at NYU. NYU has one of the best management programs in public policy in the world. So if it's management and managerial skills, so using a combination of our managing the complex world, shall we say, skeleton, you can then either reboot and retool, top up, or you can go broad, go wide. I mean, the wonderful thing about UCL is we have the Bartlett School of Planning, we have the world, Global Health Institutes, we have, various other departments that you can go through. And again, within NYU, there is a fabulous range of options. So you can make it into what you want. You can make it into something quite narrow, applied economics, or you can make it into something quite broad about managing change. So I would hope that, again, this is a unique aspect of this 1-year program. And the other aspect is, as Sherry noted, is just taking people out of their comfort zone, putting them into different cities, global cities is exciting, and then taking them and putting them with the capstones into interesting new environments as well. If they come from the World Bank, we'll certainly try and encourage them to go to the Commission. If they've been in the European Commission, let's try and get them into consultancy or Google. We will, working with our friends and with these institutions, we will try and take people out of their comfort zone a little bit and into a new environment, which will help them when they go back into the institutions they've come from. I hope that answers your question. I mean, Sherry?
I think that's right. I think that the interesting thing here is that really there is this core part of the program which is being jointly designed to address these particular sets of issues, and then there's an overlay of options that students can take in both the schools that will be very rich. So I think that's the sense in which we're trying to try and do what you'd like us to do. And it really is intended for mid-career executives. So it's a different kind of a program.
And something I should perhaps emphasize, this truly is the first joint degree. Other programs have had dual degrees, and so you template the Columbia program with the LSE program. In effect, you've got 2 years of whatever you would have been doing in these places anyway, and they haven't attempted ever to be joined up. And one of the critiques of these programs has been that you end up replicating aspects, or you end up doing more poli-sci in one and more public policy in another. This program has been designed from first principles to sort of have an intellectual exit velocity, that what you've learned in New York, you're using in London, and you're using in your capstone. So again, I think it's really exciting.
I have a comment. I haven't seen the program that's been designed, so, and I'm sure everything I'm going to say has already been addressed. So, I would strip down. My impression, there are too many options to students now, and what was lacking was a core. I mean, a lot of U.S. university, Europe, the system is different. They've come back in pretty much all the various areas to redefine fairly large core. So these options is really narrowed down, and I think this is a very good way. Of course, I would start even before postgrad, but that's fine. Let's not get into basic education there. One word of having thought in a few of these executive programs. So I was part of the problems, perhaps. One has to be careful. Governments, they live in silos themselves. So I think this executive program, they should really try to break away from these silos, because you have in the same room, somebody was the head of cabinet, somebody was being the director general of the Ministry of Education, somebody was the Minister of Finance, etc. Somebody who's come from the accounting or auditing background. They don't talk to each other, they don't move around, so the careers are really managed vertically. So when you pull them in a room, you really have to make, even at the executive, you have to make sure that you have a sort of a core, for lack of a better word. They really try to break away this so they can really see the big picture. But my experience is, if you're in government for a number of years, not that many, but you're pretty much trapped. Career-wise, specialization-wise, and you can always have one way to go, which is up, if you're lucky. And so, again, the forest and the tree syndrome comes quite early. So one of the big advantages of these programs is exactly to make people sort of realize that they're part of something which is much bigger. Now, ideally, we'd like governments to manage their own human resources, which is the only capital that governments have in the end, to really have sort of mobility program and training, etc., like private sector companies have. And very few have such programs, surprisingly.
I would like to reiterate that. I mean, that was also one of our thinkings behind this program. It's not just the progressor, the career progressor, but the career shifter. There are people that do get siloed in one organization and really would aspire to jump from domestic government into international government, or from an NGO into government, or from a government into the private sector. And so this, again, we're hoping, would help facilitate that movement and give them an opportunity to taste that world before they perhaps make that radical change in their life. I'm very aware of time, so I'm going to try and collect just a couple more questions, if there are. Okay. I will take silence then as that we are aware of time and everyone needs to get home. So first of all, I would like to then thank everybody. I'd like to thank the panel for really insightful thoughts. Your practitioner perspective really helps us with this program, and I hope we can work with you over the next few years. But thank you very much for this.
Thank you.
Thank you.